From KVUE News in Austin, you're watching Texas This Week with Ashley Goodo.
Good Sunday morning. The fourth special session of the 88th Texas legislature came to an end this week. Border bills passed, education bills failed, and the Republican infighting between the lieutenant governor and Speaker of the House reached a new level. We'll have more on that in just a minute, but first, here are 3 things you need to know in Texas politics.
The Republican Party of Texas made national headlines after the State Republican Executive Committee, which is the governing board of the Texas GOP, rejected a proposal essentially saying the party would not associate with Nazis. Scott Braddock, editor of Harvey Cronberg's The Quorum Report, joined me to talk about the fallout.
What this is really all born out of was, as you reported here earlier in the year, there is a group that's affiliated with the GOP. The head of that group, Jonathan Stickland, is a former state rep. He did meet with somebody who is an avowed Nazi sympathizer, somebody who says that Hitler was cool. And there's just this push within the Republican Party now to say, and this should be easy politics, I think, to say Nazis are bad. But the Texas Republican Party didn't do that this weekend, so a lot of people are really upset.
It's worth noting the party did pass resolutions supporting Israel and condemning anti-Semitism. The fight between Texas and the federal government over the Mexico border continues. Federal agents say some of the tactics Texas is putting in place, including concertina wire, makes their jobs harder and puts agents and migrants at risk of injuries. A judge previously gave the feds legal standing to cut the wire, but this week, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals halted that ruling so it could look into the case. 2 days after the ruling, Governor Greg Abbott shared this video of a border wall going up on social media, and on Friday, touted the state is installing new strategic border barrier. The Texas Supreme Court is temporarily blocking a Dallas woman from getting an abortion. On Thursday, a Travis County judge granted a temporary restraining order allowing Kate Cox to get an abortion. Doctors diagnosed her fetus with a deadly abnormality and say carrying the baby to term risks her ability to have children in the future. Texas doctors can face civil and criminal penalties, including being sentenced to life in prison for performing abortions. So Cox asked the courts to weigh in. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton sent letters to the 3 Houston area hospitals where Cox's doctor practices, stating the lower court's order wouldn't insulate them from civil and criminal liability, and he asked the Texas Supreme Court to weigh in. Cox's attorneys say while they hope the court will reject the state's request, they fear justice delayed will be justice denied. It's unclear when the Supreme Court could make a decision.
On Tuesday, the Texas House and Senate adjourned sine die from the 4th special session. Lawmakers sent the border bills Governor Greg Abbott asked for to his desk, but nothing related to education. Ayan Mittra, senior managing editor of the Texas Tribune, joined me to talk about what did and didn't happen in the special. You know, the end of another special session. I think when you look at the agenda that the governor set for this session, it can be really broken into 2 themes, if you will. You had your border bills and education bills. Border bills passed. Talk to us about what's going to happen now.
Yeah, well, it's also going to be interesting to see what happens in court, too, with these bills. But, you know, the legislature did pass legislation that allowed for a state crime for entering across the border from Mexico. So the legislation actually allows the state, state officers to, apprehend people who are suspected of crossing illegally and then eventually, possibly detaining them and then potentially, sending them to a judge who might hear their case and then actually take them back across the border. So, that is going to be an issue for the courts, too, because, immigration is obviously traditionally been a federal thing. So this is going to be something that will continue to be debated.
Yeah, it's interesting on several levels with this bill. One of the things I want to point out that you talked about was send them back to Mexico. Mexico is not happy about this bill. Not
at all. They very much expressed deep concerns. A lot of the migrants who are coming are not from Mexico. They are passing through Mexico. This is obviously something that is going to be a challenge for if, as this law is implemented, is going to be a challenge too. And so Mexico is raising a lot of concerns about it.
Yeah. Let's talk about the other bill that passed, and that is $1.54 billion for a border wall, which you've heard people on both sides of the aisle. We really had a lot of kind of Republican opposition to this bill this time, saying walls just don't work.
That's the perennial kind of debate about this too, of whether it's on the national level or on the statewide level of whether the walls or barriers work. But this has been a continuing debate. This just, you still hear from property owners just kind of along the border too, also still raising issues about the number of migrants coming. So there's a lot of concern, there's a lot of frustration with federal policy or the lack of federal policy. So the states are trying to take it upon themselves to solve this, but it's a really controversial thing regardless.
Let's talk about the other kind of section, and that's the education bills, and these really fell flat this session.
Boy, and this is something, that Governor Abbott, as you said, he declared this a priority early on, particularly around school vouchers, or school choice, as he calls it, was just more so of like really pushing forward. This was 2 special sessions that he called, really focusing on this issue, and something he's declared as a priority. Rural Republicans, 21 rural Republicans in the House, voted against it. They held firm as well as all Democrats, and it was just there was real concern about how it would impact the school systems locally. And even though there was a lot of lobbying and a lot of open debate about it, the rural Republicans really held firm.
Not only did we see, that plan, that thing that Governor Abbott wanted, that failed, but there was also language about teacher pay raises that could have happened, changing the school finance system that could have, those things were also sort of on the call. And when you think about the largest budget surplus and teachers don't get raises.
Yeah, and this has been a major frustration of how the debate has unfolded too, because of all these things kind of being tied up in the same legislation. I think there was a lot of advocates for putting teacher pay, student funding, raising the per student allotment separately from the school choice, the school voucher issue. But this is how it kind of played out in the regular session. They were kind of combined at the very end of the session, didn't pass during the special sessions. And now you still have this issue of, teachers who we're dealing with a teacher shortage across the state here, in a frustration with kind of compensation, as well as aspects of school safety measures and funding for those. And I think there's a lot of frustration too, because those didn't get separated in this debate, and that still needs to be resolved.
Yeah. Education savings accounts or school choice is something that Governor Greg Abbott said he would call lawmakers back. He said he was going to keep calling them back until they passed it. It's very obvious that those 21 Republicans are not changing their minds. So he's kind of switching gears on what he's doing. Tell us about his strategy now.
Well, he's moving on, it seems like, in terms of endorsements of how he's handling this politically. And he kind of said this earlier in the year, too, that, when in fighting for this, he was going to also, there will be political repercussions for those who oppose vouchers. And sure enough, he's made some endorsements against some sitting members of the Texas House who voted against the voucher plan, and so he's looking forward and looking towards the primary, and that's when he's going to try to make his next mark too. And we're not done yet necessarily with the voucher debate. It's going to continue, and his next step is really focused on the March Republican primary.
Now that is something that I think is really interesting, because if you have these constituents who are telling the sitting representatives, we're not going to vote for you if you support vouchers, is it risky for the governor to then come in and support pro-voucher rule Republicans?
Well, it's, the governor is still citing, statewide polling and statewide surveys saying that there is a lot of support for this. So not necessarily breaking down by district, but really kind of more of the widespread numbers is what he's focusing on. And we also know that in primaries, it's really the base, the kind of the hard, the really the kind of like the real, most loyal, the most kind of hardcore, the most kind of, strong base Republicans or Democrats are kind of voting, in those and deciding elections. So that's going to be kind of a key factor for March.
Yeah. I think the other thing that this special session really brought out was the Republican infighting between Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and Speaker of the House Dade Phelan.
Absolutely. I mean, we have a lieutenant governor who's actively calling for the House Speaker to step down, to resign, who is really, it's been very bitter throughout this year, whether it was about property taxes, whether it was about vouchers, whether it was about legislation. And look, the House and Senate are always going to have some disagreements, and they're always going to want to advance, their own bills. And so there's always some level. But this is a pretty high level of vitriol that's been kind of expressed, particularly just around the issue of vouchers. Dan Patrick really has been kind of outspoken against Dade Phelan, and Dade Phelan has been returning it too. And obviously the impeachment of Ken Paxton really even drove a further wedge between Patrick and Phelan over the process of how that happened.
Lieutenant Governor Patrick went as far as to say Speaker Phelan is, quote, impossible to work with. Phelan is standing firm on his record. You can read more about what they said this week at KVUE.com. That's Texas This Week.